The reservation system in India aims to provide opportunities to historically disadvantaged groups. Even if these groups get a disproportionately higher share of seats or jobs compared to their population, this helps make up for past injustices and discrimination. A rising tide lifts all boats, helping disadvantaged groups through reservations raises their socioeconomic status. This benefits Indian society as a whole. When the bottom is uplifted, it raises the top as well. For example, if lower castes gain more purchasing power through reserved jobs, they will buy more goods and services, benefiting upper caste business owners. Reservation helps bring quality education and jobs to marginalized communities that have been excluded from these opportunities, especially in the private sector. It enables their participation in nation building. Having an educated, employed population across all segments of society, irrespective of caste or background, strengthens the country. It reduces inequality and social tensions. Affirmative action policies like reservation exist in many developed countries. The US, UK, Japan, South Korea and even China have forms of quotas or preferential treatment for minorities and disadvantaged groups. This is considered an important element of an equitable society. Rather than opposing reservation based on caste, forward castes should embrace it. Uplifting the downtrodden, even if disproportionately, will indirectly benefit the upper castes as well through a stronger economy and national progress. If lower castes gain upward mobility, upper castes also gain potential consumers. So while imperfect, reservation is a tool India can use to make up for historical injustices. Progress for the disadvantaged translates into collective progress for the nation. Here are some data points to support the arguments in favor of reservation. As per the Socioeconomic Caste Census 2011, over 40% of lower caste households earn less than 5,000 rupees per month, compared to only 3% of upper caste households. This shows their economic disadvantage. The enrollment rate in higher education is 18.2% for scheduled castes and 13.3% for scheduled tribes, compared to 32% for non-SC/STs. All India Survey of Higher Education 2018-2019. Reservations help bridge this gap. In government jobs, there is still a significant representation gap. The share of SCs in central government jobs was 17.9% versus their population of 16.6%, while for STs it was 7.5% against their 8.6% population share. Annual Report, Department of Personnel and Training, 2020. A study by the India Human Development Survey shows the positive impact of reservations. It led to a 15 to 20% increase in wage earnings for lower castes and improved their standards of living. The literacy rate among Dalits has gone up from 10.3% in 1961 to 75.2% in 2011. This educational uplift is partially driven by reservations. Countries like the US, UK, Brazil also use affirmative action policies in education and jobs for their historically disadvantaged groups like blacks, Hispanics etc. to ensure diversity and social justice. So while not perfect, data shows India's reservation system has contributed to uplifting lower castes socially and economically, validating its use for now to balance inequity. Gradual reforms can improve its implementation. Here are some data points about affirmative action policies in countries other than India. In the United States, affirmative action policies vary across states but have increased minority representation in higher education. For example, at UC Berkeley, Hispanic enrollment increased from 3.6% in 1960 to over 12% in 2004 due to affirmative action. In Malaysia, the Bumiputera policy reserving jobs and college seats for ethnic Malays led to Malay control of corporate equity rising from 2.4% in 1970 to 18.9% in 1990. In South Africa, black representation in management roles has increased from 11.8% in 2002 to 16.3% in 2021 after rollout of Black Economic Empowerment BEAT program. In Brazil, quotas at public universities increased the share of black students from 2.2% in 2000 to over 12% by 2010. Graduation rates of black students also improved from 44% to 83%. In China, top universities like Tsinghua and Peking reserve minimum quotas for ethnic minorities. For example, Tsinghua enrolled 426 ethnic minority students in 2020, 9% of its freshman class. Nigeria has subnational quotas reserving federal jobs and school admissions for groups native to each state. This has increased diversity in public sector jobs vs just a few ethnic groups dominating previously. So in summary, data from US, Malaysia, South Africa, Brazil, China, Nigeria shows how affirmative action policies, when implemented effectively, can improve representation and outcomes for disadvantaged groups in different countries. This parallels the objectives of India's reservation system. Overview of caste census in Bihar showing OBCs and EBCs are 63% of population. India has been gripped by a new census, not the national one that is yet to be conducted. This is a caste census from the state of Bihar. It's exactly what it sounds like. The population data was collected based on 17 indicators, one of them was caste, and the headline result is this: two groups make up 63% of the state's population, the OBCs or the other backward classes, and EBCs, the extremely backward classes. Political debate on having a nationwide caste census. You don't do a census for the love of numbers, you do it to make policy. So what's the policy goal here? More reservation and more welfare schemes. It's become a political lightning rod. The opposition parties want a nationwide caste census in India. The ruling party says not interested. We'll keep the politics out for now. Background on caste census and reservation in India. Instead, let's look at the caste census and reservation. Why is it so important? When was it last done in India and has it delivered in the past? Time for a flashback. First things first, what is caste? Simply put, it's a system of social hierarchy. People are ranked based on their birth. Hindu texts talk about four major caste groups. At the very top are Brahmins, your priests and teachers, then come Kshatriyas the warriors, Vaishyas the traders, and finally Shudras the menial workers. Beyond these four there is another group, the Dalits, the untouchables. This group was considered outside the caste system. They were cleaner and cremators. Caste was always the reality of life in India. In many places it still is. Their reason was simple: you cannot govern what you don't know, so divisions based on caste were easy to understand, so they thought. To neatly divide India's Hindus into four categories, they were in for a surprise. In Banaras in 1834 there were 107 castes of Brahmins, so the four-category system was not always the norm. Whether there was ever a period in which the Hindus were composed of four classes is exceedingly doubtful. Despite that they pushed on. From the 1880s the official census began. Caste data was also collected back then and this practice would continue until 1941. That's the last census where caste data was collected in India, but in 1941 this data was not published. An enormous and costly table, so they said no more caste data, which means our last caste estimate is from 1931, that's around 93 years ago. Did reservation exist during this time? In some places yes it did. The princely state of Mysore was among the first to do it in 1921, they reserved seats for backward communities, basically a quota in government jobs and education. Soon Madras and Bombay followed in the 1930s, it extended to government, not without some drama though. In 1932 proposed separate electorates for backward communities. Now this is different from reserved seats. In reserved seats everyone votes, the only condition is that candidates must belong to backward communities, say SC or Saint. Separate electorates is different, here both candidates and voters will be from backward communities. This decision pitted two stalwarts against each other. Mahatma Gandhi was against it, Dr. B.R. Ambedkar supported it. To convince Ambedkar, Gandhi began a fast unto death. Eventually Ambedkar relented, he agreed to reserved seats instead of separate electorates and this would continue even after independence. India's constitution permitted quotas and reservations, not for everyone though, only two marginalized groups, the SCs that is the scheduled castes, and the STs the scheduled tribes. Implementation of reservation quotas in India. This reservation can be divided into two types, one is the political one which is temporary, the other is a social kind, your jobs and college seats. The political reservation meant quotas in elected bodies like parliament and state assemblies. That was supposed to be re-evaluated after 10 years, but nowadays there is no evaluation, there is only extension. The latest was in 2019, the SC/ST quota was extended by another 10 years. The second type of quota does not have a time frame. Many people say the founding fathers wanted it to be temporary, but the constitution does not mention it either way. This was the setup after independence and it remained so until 1979. That's when a new commission was set up, the Second Backward Classes Commission. You may know it as the Mandal Commission. It was headed by B.P. Mandal, a former Chief Minister of Bihar. It took around 2 years to finish the report. In December 1980 it was submitted and the big headline was this: OBC community should get 27% reservation both in jobs and in colleges. It wasn't implemented though, because by 1989 the government had changed. No one touched this report again for 10 years. In August 1990, then Prime Minister V.P. Singh dusted out the Mandal report. In fact, he went a step further, he decided to implement it. There were massive protests across India, hundreds of students hit the streets in major cities, dozens of them set themselves on fire. But the government pushed on, the 27% quota was implemented for OBCs. So India's reservation pie looked like this: 15% for scheduled castes, 7.5% for scheduled tribes and 27% for OBCs. The total came to 49.5%. Just one problem though, the Mandal report triggered a new era of politics. Leaders hijacked the narrative. Instead of social justice, reservation became a political tool. If you want community X to support you, give them quotas. That became the trend. So to prevent that, the Supreme Court intervened in 1992. They delivered a historic verdict. They said quotas cannot be more than 50%. Things have changed though. A new verdict says the 50% limit is flexible, but we'll get to that later. It's been 3 decades since OBC reservation was introduced in India, around 8 decades since the SC/ST quota. The big question is, has it delivered, and if not, why are we not trying something else? In 2021 the government submitted some data to the Supreme Court. They had surveyed 19 ministries and this was their finding: SCs made up around 15% of all employees, STs made up 6% and OBCs around 17.5%. We are talking about government workers here. Now compare this to the reserved quota. The SC numbers are on par but the other two are not. While 27% jobs are reserved for OBCs, they make up only 17.5% and this is a huge gap. And within this gap there's a bigger problem: most quota workers are low-level employees. In 2012 around 40% of public cleaner were SCs. Even among OBCs the biggest chunk is employed in such jobs. As you go up the hierarchy they simply disappear. Let's look at the coveted All India services, your IAS and IPS. In the last 5 years around 4,300 appointments have been made. OBCs, SCs and STs made up 27% of that, but their share of population is much higher, closer to 75%. Same with colleges, around 42% of teaching posts reserved for these communities are lying vacant, 42% vacant. So reservation has not leveled the gap. It has made gains, yes, but it hasn't solved the problem. At the same time a new problem has emerged: everyone wants a quota nowadays. At first dominant communities had rejected the idea of reservation, but clearly it's not going anywhere, so their new strategy is this: ask for their own quota. And there are examples across India. The Patel community in Gujarat wants quotas, the Marathas in Maharashtra, the Lingaites in Karnataka, the Jats in Haryana. These are politically powerful communities in their respective states, but now they want quota. So where does this end? Supreme Court's views on issues with reservation system. The Supreme Court had some interesting takes on reservation. This was last year when they said the 50% cap on quota is flexible. Here's what one judge said: at the end of 75 years of our independence we need to revisit the system of reservation in the larger interest of the society as a whole. Here's another judge: reservation is not an end but a means to secure social and economic justice. Reservation should not be allowed to become a vested interest. Unfortunately that's what it has become, a vested interest, a political tool. That doesn't mean reservation has not helped in India. It has made very important contributions to social justice, but it hasn't solved the root problem. And where does the caste census figure in this conversation? Well, numbers drive policy. That's the idea behind the caste census. We already collect SC and ST data every 10 years, the demand is to collect OBC data as well. The previous government did so in 2011, but that information was never published. The current government says the data is unusable, hence the demand for a new set. Why reservation quotas persist and issues in changing the system. There are two reasons why quotas still persist in India. One, of course, is political. Quotas help win elections, every political party has used them. And reason number two, because there is no alternative. Governments have failed to answer the most important question: if not quota, then what? Do you have a plan to change mindsets? Because let's face it, everyone is against the caste system unless of course their children decide to marry outside their caste, then it's a big issue. So India is stuck with this imperfect system. It's ironic really, our goal is to create a casteless society, yet our policy is to define and reserve based on caste.